Good evening, y'all, and welcome to this Chapter 4 reading of Kwame Nkrumah's Neo-colonialism, the last stage of imperialism. We've been enjoying going through this with y'all and having y'all be here with us in the live reading. So if you are here with us, thank you for being here. As always, if you are following along in the live reading, you can find the PDF for Kwame Nkrumah's Neo-colonialism in the pinned section of the Discord. And of course, thank you to the people who follow along on YouTube as well. And if YouTube is where you're listening from, you can go ahead and find the PDF in the description, as well as any relevant links that come up when we get to the discussion part of our reading. So let me get open to chapter 4, and then without any further ado, we'll get started with chapter 4 of Neo-colonialism, the last stage of imperialism. So this chapter is called Monopoly Capitalism and the American Dollar. It's about 17 pages, so be prepared for a chapter that's definitely not that long. Alrighty. Monopoly Capitalism and the American Dollar. The end of empire has been accompanied by a flourishing of other means of subjugation. The British Empire has become the Commonwealth, but the proceeds from the exploitation of British imperialism are increasing. Profits of British tin companies have ranged as high as 400%. The latest dividends to British diamond shareholders are close to 350%. On one occasion, Mr. Nehru declared that British profits from independent India have more than doubled, and British capital investment in his country rose from 2,065 in 1945 to 4,460 in 1960. Total British investment in Africa have soared to 6.5 million, the French to about 7 million, and American to about 1.1 million. A recent survey made plain the plunder of British monopolies. It listed 9 out of 20 of Britain's biggest monopolies as direct colonial exploiting companies. Shell, British Petroleum, British American Tobacco, Imperial Tobacco, Burma Oil, Nchanga Copper, Volcana Corporation, Rhodesian Mines, and British South Africa, 5 of which are directly engaged in chiseling away Africa's natural resources. The others are busily increasing their trading. Their total of 221 million net profits was over the combined net profits of the top 20 monopolies. Incredibly, the list leaves out 2 of the world's greatest combines, those 2 within a state, Unilever and Imperial Chemical Industries, whose operations are based heavily in their overseas exploitations. The United Africa Company leads for Unilever in Africa. About a third of the ICI and its subsidiaries operate overseas. Sir Alec Douglas Home, former Prime Minister of Britain's Tory government, in a speech made on the March 20th, 1964, professed himself ignorant of the meaning of neocolonialism. While Sir Alec was talking, Britain was engaged in what its press was busy describing as major crisis areas all over the world, putting down troubles inspired and perpetrated by neocolonialism. British Guyana, Borneo, and Sarawak against Indonesia, Cyprus, British Guyana, maintaining law and order for the recently independent governments. Is this the end of imperialism? Not according to The Economist, mouthpiece of Britain's business interests, which felt compelled to comment. Military bases, routes to the east frontier skirmishing, putting down mutinies. All this has a 19th century ring, quite naturally disturbing to those who had hoped the end of neocolonialism meant the end of military involvement east of Suez. The knobbly truth of the matter turns out to be that for the moment, Britain has as many military commitments in that area as it has ever had before colonies were replaced by Commonwealth. That's in The Economist from May 23rd, 1964. So, the intention is to hold back the progress of the developing countries, where circumstances favor the establishment of ventures of a more than token industrial character. The aim is to see that they are made haltingly. The overriding objective is to induce a merely fractional increase in the industrial scope of the new nations in order that they may continue to provide the sinews of imperialism's greater concentration of forces for the final tussle of strength within itself and against socialism. What is remarkable is that the major part of the less developed world, here we must include the USSR, chose and is choosing the socialist road to national progress. There are, in addition, countries like India, where the political system, though patterned on the bourgeois democracies of capitalism, nevertheless proclaim socialism as the socio-economic objective. The nations that have reached their present peaks by passing through the various stages of capitalism cling desperately to the system that has brought them to the heights of imperialism. Each perched perilously on a narrow summit must put up a constant battle to guard its own pinnacle. Makes sense. Capitalism is fascism in decay, after all. And he's describing the resistance to have to give way to fascism, hoping that they can cling desperately to the system without letting fascism take over, since they would necessarily tell you that that's their last resort, even if they wouldn't necessarily put it in those terms. Anyways, greater intensity is infused into the struggle by the resurgence of rivals, of whom Germany and Japan are the most virile. Both of them have benefited from strong injections of American capital. The U.S. monopolies are drawing off considerable profits from the running that is being made by these two countries in world competition, pointing to contradictions among the interests involved. Competing against American imperialism, German and Japanese monopolists are frequently in alliance with their USA opposites, who often put them forward in imperialism's general offensive against Africa, where open United States private investment might be regarded with more suspicion than others. Germany, moreover, is now second to the USA in the scale of so-called assistance to the developing countries. Since capitalism is the embodiment of the philosophy of self-interest, the ostensible allies of America's monopolists must use the position of strength into which they are being thrust to promote their own growth. This struggle for ascendancy among the imperialisms is continuous and involves a constant search for renewal of the sinews of strength. Alongside the battle for imperialist supremacy, there wages a fight against the ideological camp of socialism, into which the warring imperialists make an all-out effort to trail the developing countries as their appendages. In this way, the anti-communist campaign is used to further imperialist aims. Leaders of monopoly capitalism everywhere build up in the public mind an image of the system in social-cultural terms by which they transform it into an idealized, harmonious civilization that must be cherished at all costs. They harp upon a way of life that may be altered only to its detriment and stress its continuity as a major principle in the fight against communism. We'll pause for discussion on that point in a second. When Harold Macmillan, as Prime Minister of Britain, told the South African Parliament that what is now on trial is much more than our military strength or our diplomatic and administrative skill, it is our way of life. He epitomized the metaphysical transmutation of economic impulses into a social philosophy. This in spite of his reference to quote-unquote winds of change blowing across Africa. He echoed the several statements of the West, any of whom could have made the statement and indeed have at different times and in almost identical words, parentheses. The great issue in the second half of the 20th century is whether the uncommitted peoples of Asia and Africa will swing to the east or to the west, close parentheses. All the powerful imperialist nations are decided that the new states shall develop along the capitalist path. The provisioners of imperialism's vital needs, the source of its super profits. National liberation and the obvious advantages of socialist development for nations evolving out of a colonialist domination and without the capital means for making that development are major factors determining imperialist strategy towards these nations, in both the interest of its internal struggle and in the fight against socialism. Whew, that's already a lot, y'all. So let's pause for discussion on this one point here that I want to talk about. So this struggle for ascendancy among the imperialisms is continuous and involves a constant search for renewal of the sinews of strength. Alongside the battle for imperialist supremacy, their wages the fight against the ideological camp of socialism, into which the warring imperialists make an all-out effort to trail the developing countries as their appendages. In this way, the anti-communist campaign is used to further imperialist aims. Leaders of monopoly capitalism everywhere build up in the public mind an image of the system in social-cultural terms by which they transform it into an idealized, harmonious civilization that might be cherished at all costs. They harp upon a way of life that may be altered only to its detriment and stress its continuity as a major principle in the fight against communism. It's y'all see what he's talking about there in terms of just so he's in a lot of ways talking about Parenti's unfalsifiable orthodoxy that he mentions in, I don't know if he mentioned the unfalsifiable orthodoxy in Black Shirts and Reds. I think it was in Black Shirts and Reds, not Inventing Reality, but he's talking about this idea that what they're real good at in terms of doing anti-communist propaganda, y'all, is making these narratives that can't be debunked. So everything about the American way of life has to be maintained because dismantling it in any way is giving way to communism, which is of course the most destructive, murderous system that has ever been contrived by man and has killed, 100 billion people as of last week. Let these people tell it. He talks about, so he says, It built up in the public mind of an image of the system in social cultural terms by which they transform it into an idealized harmonious civilization that must be cherished at all costs. Literally, the conditions he's describing here are the exact kind of conditions you got people like the Proud Boys talking about when they're talking about America being a supposed, and it's hilarious that anybody would ever utter these words, but when they talk about the supposed anti-white nature of the current United States, that's the kind of shit that they're trying to talk about. The idea that, like, America is no longer white enough and needs to go back to being as white as it used to be by these people's minds. Otherwise, being any less white will give way to communism. This is literally the argument these people's making. And that any trend toward the country being more black and brown is itself an attack on harmonious civilization itself. He says harmonious civilization that must be cherished at all costs. There's understanding it this way, it's no coincidence that these people so violently hold on concept of being white, of not just capitalism, but literally the premise of being white, which itself is a construct, of capitalism, made to justify the current pecking order of things in this current status quo we all live in. So I never thought about it in these terms that he put it in. The leaders of monopoly capitalism building up this public mind, an image of a system that needs to be cherished at all costs. But you can definitely see that. If y'all got other ways, y'all notice that being built up in the public lexicon, mention those in the chat, or you can, if you want to talk about it a little bit, you can type stack in the chat and I'll give y'all some opportunity to speak. Let's continue with the reading. All countries, even the most deeply involved in a monopoly imperialism, have a state sector. Indeed, state involvement in a private economy has become an essential part of its process. It should cause no surprise, therefore, that developing countries, particularly in view of the small accumulations of local private capital, are obliged to centralize their economies. The size of the state sector and its planned expansion, however, must depend on the economic system which is chosen, capitalist or socialist. The aim of the imperialist powers in the application of their aid programs is to turn the state sector into an appendage of private capital. In view of the process that has been involved in the imperialist countries, it would be surprising if this were not so. The declared basic policy of the Agency for International Development, formerly the International Cooperation Administration, is to employ United States assistance to aid receiving countries in such a way as will encourage the development of the private sectors of their economies. Thus, ICA will normally not be prepared to finance publicly owned industrial and extractive enterprises, although it is realized that there may be exceptions. Development in the new countries along non-capitalistic lines must be frustrated in the interest of Western imperialism. A series of articles which appeared in the London Times in April 1964 outlined the pattern and made no secret of its reasons. Quote, the two great objects of Britain's foreign policy must be to prevent the non-communist world from being penetrated by communism, and secondly, to prevent her own access to trade and investment in any part of the world from being barred or limited. Naturally enough, as the articles conclude, both these objects lead straight into the neo-colonial issue, the struggle for influence, commercial and political, over the non-communist countries outside Europe and North America. Thus, succinctly does the writer in the Times expose the true character of the ideological struggle between monopolies. Leading this ideological struggle, because she leads the inter-imperialist struggle, is the USA. As the world's leading imperialist power, America lays successor claim to the so-called vacua, which the retiring colonial powers are said to leave behind as they give way to nationalist governments. Vietnam and Congo are very obvious symbols of this policy of rapid neo-colonialism. They are also examples of bitter antagonisms between American and other imperialisms. According to French Observatoire issue on June 4th, 1964, the darkest accusations are made by the U.S. against French business circles operating in South Vietnam. American experts in Asian affairs assert that French planners are not content with paying their mite to the South Vietnam National Liberation Front. They will even lend assistance and hide the guerrillas pursued by the government's army. In spite of its policies of open aggression in many parts of the globe, the United States frequently poses as the anti-colonial power in condemnation of both imperialism. The pose is within in the mass continually falls, often over critical anti-colonialist resolutions, pressed by the Afro-Asian and socialist majority in the United Nations, when the United States and Britain find themselves alone or only with France, Portugal, South Africa, and Australia, voting against or abstaining. In the last 9 years, American investments on this continent have trebled, going at a faster rate than in any other area. In 1961 alone, American monopolies profited by some 11.2 million pounds, I think that is, which they took out of Africa. No, it wouldn't be pounds. What unit of measurement is that? We'll check it out later. The rising tide of nationalism in the colonial territories were remarked by the shrewder operators of United States finance capital as America's opportunity to insinuate itself into what were the jealousy-guarded preserves of rival imperialisms. Anti-imperialist stirrings had begun to show themselves in Asia and Africa before the outbreak of the last World War. As hostilities progressed, America came out more and more openly for the ending of colonial rule. Press and other public propaganda harked back to America's own fight against colonialism. The remembrance was linked in people's minds with the budding nationalist movements that were bringing overt pressure for independence around the globe. War-torn Europe would provide part of the answer to America's needs to export investment capital and goods. But territories newly released from the political power of rival imperialisms would offer practically virgin fields. A fabulous growth in American monopoly capitalism occurred during the first 40 years of the present century. United States foreign investments vied with those of Europe, overtook and surpassed them. In 1900, American foreign investments were small by comparison with Europe's. 500 million to Britain's, with Europe's 500 million to Britain's 1,000 million. So 1.2 billion. And French's 600 million. By 1930, the growth rate of Americans' foreign investments had already overlapped those of America's foreign investment overleaped these of Britain, standing at 1.7 billion against the latter's 19,000 and way ahead of French's 7 million. Across foreign investment position was supreme by 1949 against Britain's 19 billion against Britain's 12, the level at which it had opened the century. France's level had sunk to 2 billion. The First World War eliminated Germany's foreign investments and reduced those of France. The Second World War eliminated Germany, Italy, and Japan. The American government, moreover, had added 14 to its monopolist 19 of private foreign investments. The government loans are political loans rather than direct profit-making investments, but they enhance the position of the United States finance capital by providing markets for surplus goods and by increasing profits of private American investors in the borrowing countries. The Second World War gave explosive momentum to American capitalism and helped it to increase its overseas investments and exports of manufactured goods to the colonial preserves of European and Japanese imperialism. In the decade 1938 to 1948, America's share of the imports into these territories rose from 11% to 25%. Her African trade in the period went from 150 million to 1.2 billion, at which figure it represented almost 15% of all Africans' foreign trade. So he's really getting into this idea of the United States ramping up the foreign investment, not just for the profit-making standpoint, but for the quite literal coercive relationship building that allows it to engage in exploitation and looting of countries that we still see today. He said, but they enhance the position of the United States finance capital by providing markets for surplus goods and by increasing profits of private American investors in the borrowing countries. So the investments themselves don't necessarily just turn profit, which is, of course, the main goal, but to turn that profit in the first place, they're necessarily looking to establish markets everywhere we go. This is why it's very important whenever you hear propaganda being kicked up against the country, pay attention to what the banks are doing. Pay attention to what is happening in your country's politics whenever you start hearing it say anything about another country, because oftentimes in those situations, you'll see that there's about to be some move toward some other imperialistic construct, whether it be the Democrats' Green New Deal and the way it would like to exploit Bolivia in order to fund it, or whether it be with these disastrous, never-ending wars we find ourselves in, etc. Always watch the banks whenever you hear countries, talking shit, because more than likely they'll give you a sign of what's about to happen. American monopoly's appetite was whetted by the income of 18 billion, by which it had profited from its foreign investments in the period of 1920 to 1948. The prospects in 1948 looked even richer and proved so. Between 1950 and 1959, Private American firms invested $4.5 billion in developing countries and made 3 times as much. Net profits came to $8.3 billion, to which can be added millions of dollars in trading profits, interest on loans, freight charges, and other ancillary operations. All of this was helped along by Marshall Aid, the Economic Cooperation Administration, born out of the marriage between the American state and monopoly. The dollar was brandished as the universal cure-me-quick for Europe, bringing fat super profits to its American owners. In the confusion and devastation left by war, they were to slip unobtrusively into the cozy corners from which the European imperialists would be edged out, both from Europe and its territories overseas. American financial and industrial capital used the opportunity which Europe's post-war weakness offered to draw upon its resources. It fed on war-ruined Europe, though not to the same degree as Western imperialism exploited the colonial and semi-colonial world. The powerful German metallurgical and chemical trust, Parenti, Stahlwerk, and IG Farben were broken down. The West German state, established in 1949, came under a military occupation that controlled its foreign trade, its foreign policy, and defense. But the factories which had escaped wartime destruction, some were dismantled. Many of Germany's best scientists and technicians were lured to America and Britain. The secrets and patents of the large trust were appropriated. The archives of the most important bank, Deutsche Bank, turned over to the occupying forces by Dr. Hermann J. Abs, Hitler's despoiler of Yugoslavia, who was saved from the death to which he was condemned first by the British and then by American military authorities. Germany was being made safe for the democracy of its imperialist conquerors. The Marshall Plan was used to push American imperialist penetration into the fragmented German industries and financial institutions into which it brought heavily. Large sums were also handed out to French and Belgian mining concerns in order to tighten the links with American capitalism and support its domination. An eye also had to be kept on the socialism that was advancing in Europe and Asia before the opening of the 1950s. The Cold War began to hot up. It was felt that the threat of heavy German competition, which had inspired the limitations put upon it by the victorious imperialisms, could be cushioned by drawing Germany into Western strategy and by greater participations from the United States capital. Germany's position in the metallurgical and chemical fields began to change as that country was drawn into the overall pattern of Western defense. More energetic exploration for metal and mineral resources was undertaken in Africa and elsewhere. Africa's raw materials are an important consideration in the military buildup of the NATO countries, in which are included those of the European Common Market. Their industries, especially the strategic and nuclear factories, depend largely upon the primary materials that come from the less developed countries. The Cincy Doofus says, which I love that name, by the way, Comrade says, it's German, so it's like Deutsche. Oh, okay, the Deutsche Bank. That makes sense. Thank you, Comrade. Post-war Europe sustained a precarious shortage of basic supplies for its steel manufacturers. Belgium needed more rich ores, sweetened more coal and coke, which America supplied in return for fine ores. Britain lacked pig, iron, and scrap. Her coke was short and inferior. Both France and Germany have fallen behind in coke supplies. Production of Lorraine coal was declining because of lack of equipment. German coal because the Ruhr was producing less. Investment in industries with a high value production, that is, the mineral transformation and heavy industries, while providing the opportunity to influence the German economies, and hence their policies toward United States ideological domination, did not give the same scope for the quicker and larger profits that production of primary products in the emerging countries offered. The Point Four program supported the Marshall Planners in opening up Africa to United States capital and its European associates. Before the Second World War, only 3% of American foreign investments were in Africa, and less than 5% of the continent's trade was with the United States. Firestone interest in Liberian rubber and small participations in South African and Rhodesian mines accounted for most of the $200 million invested in Africa. As the war pushed into this continent, military bases and trade connections were established by the Americans from which they pursued their greater penetrations after the end of the war. ECA Marshall Plan funds financed American exploration groups, set in the best colonial tradition to prepare the way for mining companies and military expeditions. It was announced by ECA in July 1949 that American experts with Marshall Plan aid are, quote, probing Africa from the Atlas Mountains to the Cape of Good Hope for agricultural and mineral wealth. And later on, that opportunities for American capital participation were disclosed in French North African, or lead mining rather, French Cameroon tin mining, French Congo-led zinc mining, an ECA loan to mines in Silesia, a French concern under the aegis of the Parenti Company, the fourth largest lead and zinc producer in the world, enabled Newmont Mining Corporation, an American mining and crude oil concern with 30% of its interests in South Africa and Canada, to buy into the company and manage its operations. Europe's post-war instability was turned to the United States' account in a new division of Africa. In the fall of 1949, after America had forced currency devaluation upon the European countries, a committee of leading British and American bankers was formed to push U.S. investments in Africa and other parts of the still remaining British Empire. A similar committee with similar purpose was established 2 months later between American bankers and those of France. The hand of these establishments is seen today all over Africa in the concertia that are fast laying a grip on the continent's riches. Rockefeller, Morgan, Kuhn-Loeb, and Dillon Reed institutions. The big British banks, Barclays, Lloyds, Westminster, Provincial, the investment houses pivoted around Hambros, Rothschild, Philip Hill, the French banks, Banque de Paris, des Pays Bas, Banque de Lyon, Parisien, Banque de Indochine, and Union Européenne Industrielle, Bank Worms, Credit Lyonnais, Lazard Frères, etc., and the leading German and Italian banks. These and their associates are the financial institutions that dominate the monetary and fiscal sectors in many of the newly independent states. They support the new industrial revolution of automation, electronics, and nuclear and space development, in which America plays the lead and which has swept U.S. imperialism to its present ascendancy. American groups dominant in the mining and oil processing and finishing industries are involved directly or through their bankers and financing houses and in ventures with leading European producers and their financial backers. The finance capitalists who control the leading corporations in the extractive, metallurgical, chemical, nuclear, and space industries of the West are to be seen stretching out across the 7 seas and taking command of the sources of primary materials in Asia, Oceania, Australia, New Zealand, Central and South America, and Africa. U.S. investments in Canada in 1962 went up by nearly $700 million, mostly for developing iron ore properties. An additional $270 million invested in other developed countries, with mainly Australia and Japan. Latin American investments in the United States capital increased by $250 million in 1962. In the previous year, the increase was over $400 million. The U.S. Department of Commerce reported that private American investments in assets overseas reached $60 billion at the end of 1962 and advanced a further $3 billion in the first 6 months of 1963. Private investors in the United States added $4.3 billion in 1962 to their holdings of assets and investments abroad. Direct private American investment in Africa increased between 1945 and 1958 from 110 million to 789 million, most of it drawn from profits. For the increase of 679 million, actual new money invested during the period was of the increase of 679 million. Actually, new money invested during the period was only 149 million. The United States profits from those investments, including reinvestment of surpluses, being estimated at 704 million. As a result, African countries sustained losses of 555 million. If allowance is made for grants for non-military purposes, estimated by the U.S. Congress at $136 million, Africa's net total losses still reach $419 million. Official American statistics puts the gross made by U.S. monopolies in Africa between 1946 and 1959 at $1.2 billion, through other estimates place them at $1.5 billion. Whichever way they are looked at, it requires no great mathematical mind to make out from these figures the almost 100% profitability on investment in Africa. The avid explorations that have gone on apace in the last 2 or 3 decades for additional reserves of all the metals and minerals that are important for modern industrial supremacy have been instigated by the drive for monopoly, upon which supremacy and its super profits rest. A recent example makes the principle clear. Alkyn Industries, a British associate of Alcoa Aluminium Company of America, through Alkyn Aluminium Ltd. of Canada, according to the Sunday Times headline issue from October 18, 1964, wrapped up, parentheses, the last of the foil, close parentheses. That is, Alkyn Industries paid $5.5 million to take over the last independent firm, Fisher's Foils, in British aluminum foil making, having already swallowed most of the rest. This was done, it is said, to bring about rationalization, both in boardroom talk, but in boardroom talk, it has another meaning, suing up the industry. So one thing that's jumping out at me, y'all, is I like read through this and I'm like taking a look at these numbers and thinking about just like the exorbitant rate of profit is like exactly what it means when there's like economic recession on a global level. Because he's talking about these countries having this rate of profit, talking about Africa losing African countries sustaining losses of 555 million, and the net profit from investments, including reinvestment from surplus, being 704 million from the U.S. alone. So, like, that necessarily has to mean, right, that like if there's global recession, which is meaning like which necessarily might imply a net loss in profit. They are looting these countries, colonizing these countries, at a loss. At some point, it's so unsustainable in terms of how they're putting things back onto the market, what they're selling them for what the value of the dollar actually is, that imperialism can be unprofitable sometimes. That's necessarily what a recession seems to be from what Nkrumah is talking about here. The idea that itself, a recession is nothing more than imperialism, that for whatever reason, whether it be market forces, banks, or whatever, and I'm sure he'll get into that, or maybe some other work will get into that, isn't able to make no damn money. That's a wow. So like imperialism can be engaged in a way where like people are dying and being exploited and being looted. And the colonizing country isn't even getting whatever benefit it sought to get, which like is interesting because that plays into the logic of a protracted war in the first place. The idea that like superior economic might and military might can be overcome by superior political might. And you can see the kind of conditions that might necessarily lead to being able to overcome a military and an economy. If you are withholding production, if you are in relationship with other countries and other nations that the colonial powers have relationships with and are convincing them to withhold production as well, you can really hit these people in the pocketbook so hard they don't have no choice but to acquiesce to the whims of anti-imperialism and decolonization, just so that they have an opportunity to turn any profit at all. You can quite literally make the whole damn institution not profitable enough for them to even bother. So that's wild to me. The implication there is wild. Did anybody else have any thoughts? So, part of the objective of gaining control of industries and newfound raw materials sources is to deprive rivals of their use. The manipulation of artificial scarcity is another of monopoly's tactics for maintaining profits. For 3 years until mid-1964, the big copper companies were running production at between 80 and 85% of capacity to keep up prices. Steel production, too, was held back to something like 80% of capacity. Exploitation under imperialism does not, nor will, always follow upon the finding of new sources of raw materials. That's a super interesting point, this idea that they'll take a loss in some cases. He's saying steel production was needing to be scaled back to 80 to 85% of its capacity, and that was a preferable option to like opening up a new market for steel in some other country that might naturally produce that as a resource. Necessarily going how like there's an initial, that's talking about how there's an initial investment in even occupying a country and trying to start a new relationship and opening up those markets that is sometimes not at all worth it for the capitalists. They'd rather scale back production and quite literally make less stuff than invest and opening and trying to colonize another country that might make, in this example, steel, for example. So that's a interesting point that he's bringing up here. The logic of capital is just never ceases to amaze me, and be honest with y'all. Sometimes they're willing to colonize, other times they'd rather scale back in a place where they already are. Yeah. I couldn't even tell y'all I understand, to be honest with y'all. Whoever monopolizes the major sources of supply controls output by having the decisive voice in what deposits shall or shall not be worked, and to what degree. Monopoly allows the monopolist to manipulate the economies of other countries in their interests. In the case of bauxite, for instance, Mellon dominated Alcoa is sovereign and has drawn into its orbit the other major producers, Kaiser and Reynolds. Because of the tremendous cost of building power plants, upon which the conversion of bauxite into alumina depends, the exploitation of all known reserves of this ore by private capital would defeat the prime incentive of monopoly profit. For the superabundant production that would result would depress prices. So, I guess that answers the question to a certain extent of why they're willing to scale down production rather than just open up new markets sometime, because he's talking about this idea that price suppression can happen, and if price suppression goes down and people are quite literally having to pay less for what's already on the market, then that obviously necessarily hits the capitalist in the pocketbook. It hurts the profits, and that's obviously an abhorrent idea to the capitalist. Ooh, how dare you not turn a profit? Oh my. All right. So West Africa is exceptionally rich in bauxite, but the individual countries are not equally favored with the power to develop resources. Ghana is providing hydroelectric power, which could be used to convert alumina in both Ghana and Guinea. This would be a welcome cooperative effort within the framework of a united continental economy. So there's really nothing more to say on that part of the analysis. So another weapon that is held over the heads of the primary producing countries is the threat of using synthetic alternatives and the replacement of traditional metals by others. Synthetic diamond plants have been established by De Beers, the world's monopolist in natural diamonds, by the Belgian company MIBA, which controls Congo's natural diamonds, the largest supplier in Africa, by the General Electric Corporation in the US, and by Japan. The price of copper was held down by the main producers on the London metal market at a period of recession, and its marketing because of the likely use of aluminum in its place for certain purposes, while plastics, on the other hand, are frequently proposed as an alternative to aluminum. And Zoe says, not turning a profit is literally death to capital. The whole function of capital is the self-expansion of value. And if they can't do that, it perishes. Huh. That makes a lot of this, when you think of it like that, it puts a lot of this in the greater context. The idea that scaling down production, increasing the scale of production, opening new markets, closing down markets is all in the name of trying to expand on the value of things. Everything is about what value it has to the capitalist and what is its role in generating profit. And so that's a good point. Thank you, Zoe. The price of copper was held down by the main producers on the London metal market at a period of recession in its marketing because of the likely use of aluminum in its place for certain purposes, while plastics, on the other hand, are frequently proposed as an alternative to aluminum. Vast sums are expended in research for new materials and in scientific invention of labor-saving machinery and equipment. Thus, metals that are being threatened with substitution are at the time being developed for a wider variety of finished goods. Such research projects and the re-equipment of factories and industries, which must be done if the original investment is to be justified, calls for tremendous capital sums, which frequently can only be met from the assets of financial and insurance establishments. Consequently, banks and insurance companies dominate industrial finance and exercise a leading role in the push for monopolist ascendancy. The banks and insurance companies have been foremost in a process that has brought monopoly to its present peak. And it is their financial power that supports the increasing movement towards greater and greater concentration of monopoly. You would think this greater and greater concentration of monopoly would bring the imperialist powers in together in conflict with each other, right? How can you continue to expand and grow monopolies while at the same time acquiescing to the interest of your so-called imperial allies? That's an interesting contradiction to me. I wonder if he'll expand on that, or if there's something else we can read to understand how these imperialists manage to manage the carving up of the whole world, as Lenin would put it. Today, competition and the thrust to secure and hold monopoly over whole industries and sources of raw materials has intensified to the point where mergers are taking place at a dizzy rate. The struggle is grimly tense, and in the ding-dong battle for domination, a truce is arranged at critical points, by which influence is divided with mutual consent. Harmony, however, is more apparent than real. The struggle for redivision is proceeding all the time, and the changes that take place within the combining organizations are observed to be more and more frequent. Present-day monopoly is highly variegated. Could you post a definition of that in the chat, Zoe, and spread out? While it draws its strength from its monopolistic position, it is, on the other hand, seriously exposed to the dangers that face a multiple organism that stretches its limbs to extremity in different directions. A fracture at any one point can lead to a disjunction, which may unbalance the structure. And the monopoly's rivals are always on the alert to post its most exposed parts in order to deliver a blow that will enable the most relentless competitor to insinuate into the broken organ. Variegated, having discrete markings or different colors. Present-day monopoly is highly variegated and spread out, and then varied. Appreciate it. Varied. Nice. Hence, monopoly, having passed through the stages of cartelization, combined trust and syndicate, is today more and more making use of a further protective safeguard. That is the consortium, through which it aims at immobilizing the rivals and disarming associates who are permitted to join the most ravishing of imperialist contrivances. Usually in a consortium, there is a dominant party, either directly or through and with affiliates and associates, which enables it to exert the largest influence upon the affairs of the consortium. Furthermore, each of the parties to the consortium will have its own strength and advantages or even a principle standing outside the consortium. All continue to fight outside, while those within exercise their efforts to enlarge the importance of the share of the group activities. For example, as a monopoly, it will be in control of a complex of companies connected at many levels within the production of primary materials. They're processing from the original state right through all the stages of transformation into a variety of semi-finished and finished goods, from the most ordinary article to the most complicated and delicate equipment and heavy plant and machinery. The monopoly does not restrict itself to a single raw material, though it will be preeminent in one or two. Nor does it restrict itself to any particular department of manufacture or enterprise that may be ancillary to its basic activities, though here, again, it may specialize in certain lines. Many monopolies branch into real estate and land development projects, as construction and contracting work bring quick and high returns and high rents. This form of capital investment is growing rapidly in the present era of enlarging industrialization and the growth of new towns, and extends to large-scale agriculture. Oh, yeah. I mean, we can see that today. And, when you go take a look at Divest Twitter, their whole thing is about taking advantage of the housing market to price poor people out and resell these houses at exorbitant rates and shit. And Nkrumah was talking about that process had already started scaling up in his time, and we still see that shit being used for exploitation of the little guy today. That's some wild shit, yo. All right. In Africa, the consortium is making the most sinister penetrations. It extends from the monopolistic amalgamations of America and European finance capital, particularly those combined with the European common market, where financial consortia have been set up as the most effective means of profiting from the competitive struggle that is spiraling within this so-called unifying organization, where the primary objective is to monopolize Africa's resources of raw materials, not, as it is claimed, to assist the African countries to develop their economies. But the materials are carried off largely in their raw state or as concentrates to enhance the productive output of the imperialist countries, and to be returned to them in the form of heavy equipment for extractive industry and the infrastructure for carrying the resources away. Well, that's a crazy ass point. I hadn't thought about it like that. Not only do they go into your country, loot your goods, and force you to export raw materials, the things that they produce when they send them back to the home country, to the European countries, here to America, and the other imperial country, are just going to be used when they're sent back, more in the interest of more extraction, more efficient looting, all that kind of shit. Construction materials, shovels, bulldozers, all that stuff. All the shit that necessarily helps them with more looting. More imperialism. That's fucking wild. I never put it together in my head like that. But he's laying it all out to bear. But the materials are carried off largely in their raw state or as concentrates to enhance the productive output of the imperialist countries, and to be returned to them in the form of heavy equipment for extractive industry and the infrastructure for carrying the resources away. That's super important. I might talk a little shit about that later on Twitter. It is out of the revenue from the trade in these materials that the African countries look to amass part of the capital that will make it possible for them to utilize these same commodities in the service of their own development. Paradoxically, however, these precious counters in Africa's future are meantime being used to widen the economic gap between her and the highly industrialized countries, which are hurriedly exploiting the opportunity to make good deficiencies in their economies. Since those who are carrying on the exploitation are also the monopolists who manipulate the markets for primary products at the one end and the price for the final products at the other, the countries of origin must be pinned down to a long wait before they can tackle on a major scale the capital problem facing all the developing countries of seriously raising the standard of life of their people. If they make no effort to gird their resources in a more practical and self-supporting manner, this is the answer to those pious economists who assure us that what matters is not what is taken out of their lands, but what is left behind. The reply has been given by the Commission for Aid to Development of OECD. What's OECD? In its estimates that if the industrial countries continue to increase their gross national product by 3% per annum, it will take the less developed countries 200 years at least to catch up with their standard of living, assuming that the unindustrialized nations reach an annual increase of 5%. Yet, how problematical the achievement of this 5% remains in the light of the drain on resources from the less developed countries to the highly developed ones. In most African countries, the rate of rise in the domestic product has barely kept pace with the rate of population growth of 2.5% to 3%. It is the less developed countries that continue to carry the burden of the increasing development of the highly developed. OECD is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, y'all. Thank you, Zoe. Firestone, for example, has taken $160 million worth of rubber out of Liberia in the past quarter century. In return, the Liberian government has received a paltry $8 million. Death to France. Let's see. I'll tell you the truth. Jesus Christ. And death to America. In return, the Liberian government has received a paltry $8 million. He said, America has taken $160 million of profit for just $8 million in the way of rubber. That's crazy as hell. I know, right, Jamie? Fuck 'em. All right, the average net profit made by this American company is 3 times the entire Liberian revenue. That's fucking ridiculous, yo. From south to north, financial and industrial consortia have spread across Africa, busily staking out claims to mineral, metal, and fuel resources, to forest and land produce, and erecting extractive and primary conversion industries in which they are entrenched as stanchions. In Algeria, for example, the really big investment stampede coincided with the era of national liberation. Between 1951 and 1955, there was an inrush of French and French-American investment greater than ever before. Win or lose, the financial and industrial interests were entrenching themselves within the Algerian economy. Throughout Africa, the industrial giants are supported by financial institutions which dominate the monetary and fiscal sectors of so many of the independent states. Most heavily engaged are the mammoth banking and insurance institutions and the multimillionaire companies they control, bolstered by the international institutions like the World Bank and its affiliates. Those formidable alliances radiate from the US, Britain, Germany, France, Holland, Italy, and Sweden. They move around the metallurgical and chemical combines with the ECSC, the European Coal and Steel Community, such as SOLAC, GIS, Groupement d'Industrie Sidérurgique. I definitely botched that, but I tried, y'all. Sidalor, Union Sidérurgique, Lorraine, Usinor, Union Sidérurgique du Nord de la France, Krupp, Thyssen, Kuhlmann, Pere de Latte, Farborke, Host, Bayer, BASF, which is Badisha Nalan and Soda Fabrique, ICI. They are in the assemblages of bankers such as Consortium Européen pour le Développement des Ressources Naturelles de l'Afrique, situated at the same address as the International Bank in Luxembourg. European Compagnie Bancaire, Finsider, Confirmier, Union, European Industrielle et Financière, and others. Powerful American corporations like Bethlehem Steel, United States Steel, Republic Steel, Armco Steel, Newmont Mining, Johns Manville, Union Carbide, Olin Matheson, Alcoa, Kaiser, crop up among all the post-war primary materials projects on this continent. Their alliances are spread among the leading metallurgical and financial companies of Europe in combinations that match the underlying competition. This competitiveness erupts to the surface when circumstances cause a breakdown in the facade of peaceful coexistence between rival imperialists operating in the sovereign states of others, to which they make assumptions of power and use as pawns in the struggle for monopolistic supremacy. Gabon is vocal testimony to these assertions. Mass discontent with the existing regimes, which led to the disorders of February 1964, was the occasion utilized by France to warn the United States that she would brook no encroachment on the claims she lays to the Manganese, uranium, and oil riches of this, her former colony. Neglected under the colonial regime, these resources have assumed inestimable value to France in the struggle against the advance of American imperialism in Europe in the epoch of atomic rivalry. France sent in paratroopers to force the issue of whose pawn Gabon would remain. The United States still may have the dominant participation in common law, see the Oboe, which is working on the bed of the vastly rich Franceville manganese deposits. But France still to see this mine, the uranium that Franceville controls the uranium field at Munana and is urgently occupied in the attempt to foil the aspirations of the American oil barons to undisputed access to Gabon's offshore petroleum reaches. So we've wrapped up chapter 4 of Neo-colonialism, y'all. That was quite a handful to read. So it was real interesting how the basic gist of what he was talking about there was this idea that like imperialism itself is just a conquest and contest of exploitation, between these different imperialist powers. They're quite literally going into other people's countries and quite literally trying to figure out how it is they can get a leg up over countries that are supposed to be their allies. So it's with that in mind that we have to resist imperialism, understanding that necessarily speaking, these countries will just continue to try to scale up their imperialistic efforts, and that's only going to ever have a detrimental effect for Africans and other marginalized folks across the diaspora and across the working class of the world. So those are my thoughts. What is Zoe's typing? So I'll see what Zoe has to say before we wrap up. And yeah, we got chapter 5 to look forward to next week. So y'all got that to look forward to. Y'all got Walter Rodney to look forward to tomorrow, women racing class on Wednesday. And on Saturday, we're moving the normal time slot from 5 to 2 so that more people can be there for Michael Parenti. Zoe says, the sole reason for the global north investing in the development of the global south is so that it can develop the technology and infrastructure for gutting it out of its resources as efficiently as possible. Yeah, he's literally talking about that. When he was talking about exporting raw materials and then re-importing those raw materials in the form of like production goods that can be used to do imperialism more efficiently. Like, yeah, that's the purpose. They don't care about the development of these countries. They only need these countries to stay active in so much as it needs to be able to continue to like make these investments, make these deals. It needs facilitators. If it didn't need that, it would have tried to complete the genocide of every person in the global south that wasn't an imperial ally. So that's a fantastic point, Zoe. And with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap up. We got a lot to look forward to. Chapter 5 next week is going to be about 15 pages, but the chapter the week after that is going to be 26 pages. So we're going to need people to volunteer for the reading when it gets to chapter 6, because that goes all the way from 84 to 110, and I don't think I can read the whole time myself. So y'all be thinking about volunteering when we get to that chapter. But of course, as always, comrades, y'all know I love y'all. Solidarity always. And I will see you guys for the next reading. Ta-ta for now.